Hello, saints and scholars. Welcome back to Theolife, where today we're going to ask, what came first, the Peter or the Jude? As we've previously noted, there's like a ton of crossover between 2 Peter and Jude. Of the 25 verses we see in the book of Jude, 18 of them have direct parallels in the book of 2 Peter. This amount of overlap could not possibly be the result of a mere coincidence. However we look at it, we have to note that somebody copied from the other person. This is kind of weird and might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. If I find that 18 out of the 25 lines in your homework match up with another kid in your class, we're gonna have a problem. Because copying that much material is kind of seen as a little bit dishonest, and we really don't see Jude, giving a shout out to Peter. Even 2,000 years ago, people understood the concept of plagiarism.
Okay, stop copying me. Stop copying me!
But the question is, would it have been that bad for someone to do that? There's a fair chance the authors both knew one another. Peter totally loved your sermon. It was like awesome. Would you mind if I borrowed a little bit of that? Because dude, it's gonna really speak to my people. It's just what we were talking about. Considering we do know in the early days of Christianity there was a conscious effort to get the letters out there to as many places as possible as quickly as possible. So it's quite likely the early church didn't have a concept of plagiarism in the way that we understand it today. So let's ask the question, which came first, the Peter or the Jude? There are three major theories related to the overlap between Peter and Jude. Point number one, they had a common source. This theory suggests that there was a document that was kind of floating around the early church that basically surmised the theological teachings of both 2 Peter and Jude. And both authors, independent of one another, viewed this document. After viewing the document, they both kind of borrowed from it heavily, and the two letters came from this shared document without finding connectivity with one another. It could be an early Christian hymn, it could be a very popular sermon. There's no way to know the nature of this document. Now, I'm gonna be honest here, I really don't like the whole mystery document hypothesis. Reason I don't like it? There's no evidence a document exists. I really don't like theories that are based on no evidence whatsoever. For much of Christian history, we've had ideas like the Q document, which was the source for all the gospel knowledge, or the hypothesis that there's a JEDP source that kind of brings together the Pentateuch. Yet the more we dig into these documents and understand their incredible rhetorical, poetic nature, we see that they come together as one unified, incredible voice. The Pentateuch and the Gospels are not a patchwork of different sources taken from different locations, but rather they seem to have one unified, powerful voice bringing together one central message. The common source hypothesis is a bit of an easy out where you can imagine any document existing that sort of covers all your bases. But the reality is there's no evidence such a document exists, and the more historians have relied on documents like this, the more we've come up short. Theory number two, Jude copied Peter. The reason many scholars support this theory is that it is likely Jude was illiterate and the letter of Jude is written in an incredibly ornate form of Greek. We read in 1 Peter that Peter likely had the use of an amanuensis in order to write his letters. Because of this, it's possible that Jude borrowed this very ornate Greek style from a source like 2 Peter and possibly other sources, and Jude, being an oral learner, just kind of memorized all of the beautiful lines that were found throughout these texts and then had someone else write it into one cohesive sermon. In our previous video, we noted that according to tradition, Jude's granddaughters spoke about how they were impoverished Galilean peasants. And it's very unlikely that impoverished Galilean peasants would have had the education necessary to learn how to read and write. So if Jude is illiterate and the letter of Jude is very ornate, it would really necessitate the person of Jude having another source from which they could pull all of their very ornate Greek information. As we know, Peter may not have been highly educated, but he likely had access to people who were, and enabled him to write in a form of ornate Greek. Thus, there is a possibility that Jude was written by the illiterate, oral learning Jude, taking sections from sermons and letters he had heard in other places and bringing them together to make one cohesive, very beautiful, ornate sermon. Theory number 3, Peter copied from Jude. This theory is really interesting, and it is based on the idea that Peter expands upon the ideas of Jude as opposed to Jude expanding upon the ideas of Peter. We actually see that Jude will take one idea, write about it in a very succinct form, then Peter will take the exact same idea, yet drastically expound upon it.
For certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago have secretly slipped in among you. They are ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into a license for immorality and deny Jesus Christ, our only sovereign and Lord. But there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct, and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed, these teachers have exploited you with fabricated stories. Their condemnation has long been hanging over them. Their destruction has not been sleeping.
What we find when people copy ancient texts, they tend to add, but they don't tend to subtract. When ancient copyists were writing down copies of the scriptures, they would sometimes add a letter of explanation to maybe point out an interesting fact about a certain piece of geography, or to bring theological clarity to a section of scripture. But it was very rare for the authors to completely cut out a section of scripture. So when one is looking at ancient manuscripts and trying to determine which one is the oldest, one of the best rules you can use is which one has the least amount of writing. The least amount of writing is generally the earliest because people tended to add and not take away. Therefore, if Jude writes his letters in a very succinct way in just one sentence, and Peter takes the same idea but drastically expands upon it, based on this principle of biblical criticism, we would determine that Peter copied from Jude, not Jude from Peter. But what is the final answer? Dude, there's like so many options, but hey, you decide. Let's close today with a review.
When studying the books of 2 Peter and Jude, it is immediately clear that there is a tremendous amount of shared material. This leads theologians and biblical exegetes to question who copied from whom. For this, there are three main theories. The first being that both copied from a common source. This would mean that there was another Christian document from which both writers borrowed heavily, and that would explain the coincidence in both of their writing. Yet no document has ever been found to support this hypothesis. The second theory is that Jude copied from Peter. The reason this theory has support is Jude was likely illiterate, yet the letter of Jude is written in a very ornate form of poetic Greek. Therefore, some have believed that Jude must have copied from another source, as someone of his educational level did not have the necessary knowledge needed to compose such a letter. Theory number 3 tells us that Peter copied from Jude. This theory is supported by the fact that Peter expounds upon Jude, but Jude does not expound upon Peter. Biblical criticism shows us that the text with the least amount of writing tends to be the earliest. Copyists tend to add information to expound upon an idea or give greater clarity to the audience, yet we don't find copyists take away sections of the scripture in order to be clearer. Therefore, since 2 Peter expounds upon the ideas of Jude, it is more likely that 2 Peter was a copy from the book of Jude. Thank you for joining us on Theolife. May God be with you.